When I first started this Mike being the most powerful entertainer of all time series, I did it as a curiosity. Don't get me wrong, I am an MJ fan, a big one, but I honestly didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went. Part 1 had me describing the facts, straight up how MJ got the ATV catalog and merged with Sony. Kind of a shallow pop culture thing. Part 2 got me delving deep into the high probabilities of Mike being a victim of a conspiracy against him, precisely because of this Sony ATV merge. They were theories. Part 3 though, this video, it goes into the details, which include facts that form the basis for the theories I have. And I gotta admit, it's darker and eerier than the first 2 parts. As I started doing my research for the script, I realized that Mike's relationship with Sony was more complex than I thought it would ever be. There are some details in some of these contracts I'm gonna show that first of all don't make sense to me, and second of all makes this whole partnership with Sony more suspicious than I thought it would be originally. Even as an MJ fan, I was kind of in disbelief of some of the contracts that supposedly Mike signed in 1997. In part 2, I included an important element, something I'll touch on in this video: how John Branca, one of Mike's attorneys, via the Michael Jackson estate in 2016 sold MJ's ATV part to Sony after a clause made it possible for each side to buy out the other was triggered. If MJ was alive, as I said in part 2, I'm sure he wouldn't have sold his ATV part. At the end of part 2, the clause that got triggered pulled my attention. The question I wanted an answer to in part 2 was, what is this mysterious clause that got triggered that made it possible for Branca to sell Mike's ATV part back to Sony? I had an intuitive feeling that this was the right place for me to dig further in a sea that is, so vast that it's hardly easy to know where to do research. I don't think you'll like this clause/section. It's what I will base part 3 on. After finding the 1997 contract that has this section in it, I even hired a law graduate to read it thoroughly, and we both agreed that this section I'm going to talk about further in detail is quite disturbing, as I said, and puzzling to say the least. The mystery about Michael Jackson, and honestly why I haven't heard anything about this in the mainstream media, even from music journalists, is strange to say the least. If contracts such as these are mainstay in the music industry, and I hope not, the music industry is truly the breeding ground of the devil, because the theories I have might underpin that people have formed contracts such as these, thus have an incentive to do malicious things for the contracts to go into action. Why would Michael Jackson sign a contract with such a section on it? I'll come back to this contract and clause. Bear with me. It's important that we get the foundation built first. It basically continues where we left off on part 2, the This Is It concerts, Mike's last ventures into performance. So, continuing where we left off on part 2, basically the This Is It concerts, I learned something interesting about the last days of Mike. And Through a Brother's Eyes, a book that Mike's brother, Jermaine Jackson, wrote, he said something that made me realize how desperate the last days of Michael actually was. On the outside, the This Is It concerts seemed like a last victory lap for a legend that was ready to retire. And they were, at least seemingly, but what the public does not know, unless you're a big MJ fan who has done research, and I believe there are many of us, according to Jermaine, and I didn't know this myself, Mike's ATV part was held as a security for AEG Sony as Michael was going through the This Is It process. That meant that if Michael Jackson was not able to do the shows, he would not be able to pay off his debt, which was his reason for doing them. But since Michael was highly in debt, AEG and Sony had to have something as a security, probably to pay off the high costs of arranging and producing the concerts or something, I don't know. Imagine the pressure Michael was going through at that time, doing everything in his power to make sure that the ATV part stayed with him. Michael was under a lot of pressure to complete these shows one way or another. I'm gonna come back to this Is It part later at the end because it ties in. Now, if we go back to the section or clause that triggered the 2016 sale of Mike's ATV part to Sony, I dug around some pages beyond YouTube and social media, the rest of the internet, and stumbled upon the official contracts that seem to have been signed by MJ in 1997. It's a 15-page document that has a lot of legal jargon in a language that was hard for me to understand because I'm not a law graduate person, but basically also includes reasons for an exit strategy in case something would happen to the artist. After reading through the contract in which this section is, section 7.8, I found the possible trigger for the 2016 sale of the ATV catalog, the move that made it possible for Sony to buy ATV in 2016, a move that I'm sure Michael would not want if he was still alive. The section is both a bit disturbing and puzzling at the same time. The disturbing part might not be evident until the end. Bear with me. What triggered this clause that made it possible for Sony to buy ATV is as fragile as, you guessed it, Michael's own life. In the 1997 contract they made regarding this, the contract clearly states in section 7.8 that, quote, the MJ estate upon the earlier death of Michael Jackson shall have the right to notify the other members in writing that they wish to implement an exit strategy from the company. This means that in the case Michael dies, the MJ estate can notify other members that they wish to exit from the company. A life is fragile in and of itself, but Mike's life was even more fragile, especially, concerning his fame. Even though I had my rational takes on this, I couldn't just base my research on my thinking alone. I'm not a lawyer with a law degree, as I said, so I decided to outsource this contract via Fiverr, just to be sure that what I'm thinking here is actually what I think it is. I sent Enino777, who I recommend on Fiverr by the way, if you need proofreading for legal contracts, to read over MJ's contract. After working for some days, he sent me a summary back, and this is what he said. At the very onset, one will see exit strategy provisions to be fair and just, as it's required by every standardized artist contract. However, it becomes worrying to note that the trigger notice inserted under the contract was only based upon the death of MJ, or also liquidation of Sony of any other major factor, such as pandemic or ill health. For this reason, it's easy for a third party to impute that Sony only contemplated the death of MJ as the best possible way to exit the contract. He goes on to saying, the underlying principle in all exit strategy leads to only one irresistible conclusion. That is, Sony's contemplation to cash out the proceeds of the deal with MJ as soon as MJ is deceased. And as a conclusion, he says, with the circumstances surrounding the untimely demise of MJ in mind, coupled with the staggering 50% interest accrued by MJ in the deal with Sony, one could argue that it was only a matter of time that the party on whom Section 7.8 inures to be beneficial to will cause an exit strategy. And lastly, he says, as I'm saying in my videos, however, this is only a theory as there is no concrete evidence linking the circumstances above to the contract between MJ and Sony Music. So in sum, Enino777, shoutouts to Enino, is saying that exit strategies are normal procedures of a contract, but that MJ's catalyst for the trigger was not normal, and that his lawyers had implemented it on MJ's behalf. We went back and forth after the work was done, and as you can see, he had some interesting points. For instance, that artists oftentimes see a huge amount of money up front with the logic that the likelihood of their death being inevitable sooner or later, as, it's going to happen anyway kind of way. Perhaps not thinking about the effects of such wording might be a logical, possible reason for such a section to be implemented. But this is something I can see being the rationale behind 360 deals young artists often take in the music industry, with royalties, not their own life, as a trade-off for a binding contract. I don't think any amount of money in the world is worth one life as a trade-off, no matter how big the money lump is. I don't think anyone would do it. So we both came to the same conclusion, that the only logical thing here was that the lawyers didn't have his interest in mind when implementing this 7.8 section in the contract, and that MJ, or anyone else for that sake, one way or another, would have known that his death would be a good incentive for some dark people out there to kill him based on the aftermath of this contract. That's why his signature doesn't make sense to me. I'll come back to the signature, but it's important to say this though. This 7.8 section does not in and of itself imply that MJ's death will lead to Sony being able to buy out ATV. It simply means that it's an exit strategy, a separation of ATV and Sony. It makes it possible to buy the other side because they are now, as they've exited, two separate entities that legally can buy out the other as a single corporation. One half is not shared anymore, with the second half as one unit, as was the idea when the Sony ATV merging first happened in 1995, but can instead be owned by one single entity because there now is something to be bought. Nothing can be bought if ATV and Sony is merged, split apart as an effect of, an exit strategy. One part can buy out the other. So basically, although Section 7.8 does not directly say that each part can buy out the other, it definitely makes it possible for it to happen by them separating, because they're separate now. If a villain, let's just say for argument's sake, existed, this exit strategy could have been the perfect precursor, a disguise, maybe as a wolf in sheep's clothing, to buy or sell out the other half in the future. This section was the reason that Sony was able to buy ATV in 2016 after MJ's death, and they were legally able to do this. Mike surely would have thought of this, a mastermind he was when he signed the contract. If he signed the contract. If he had thought of it, there was a potential that Michael's part of the Sony ATV catalog was not being inherited by family members after his death, but sold to a corporation, like they were. After all, the head of the MJ estate after Mike's death was someone else than Mike's blood-related family. It was John Branca, as I said in part 2. But in Jermaine's book, he says, and this is the reason why I don't think Michael signed this. I'm quoting from Jermaine here. He had told Mother he wanted to make business decisions that meant our family will never have to worry about money anymore. If Mike said this, which is likely, and he had thought about the possibilities of ATV being sold back to a corporation he wasn't on best terms with, why would he sign a contract that clearly goes against this? If he at all had thought about this possibility, why would Michael sign a contract that even comes close to making this happen? Corporation owning his hard-earned part. On one of the pages, we can see the signatures of all the players in this contract. On the last page, we see Mike's, but we mysteriously enough don't see Mike's on some of the other pages. I don't know, maybe it's a law contract thing that we don't know of. Some fields can maybe be left open. I don't know. The last signature is his signature. I tried to see if the signature matched with some of Mike's other signatures when searching up images of them. This is the one in this contract, and these are some of many of his other signatures. I'm not gonna say anything here except ask the question, do they match? What do you think? Look at them. So why would he sign a contract that directly goes against him and his family? This section 7.8 is literally negative for him. As I've said, he must have thought this far. Imagine Elon Musk owning 50% of Twitter. Do you think Elon would sign a contract that said that the 50% of his part could be bought out by Twitter themselves if Elon was to die early? The definition of the word ownership goes out the way. With such a contract, Elon wouldn't have owned that 50% of Twitter if they could just buy it back after his death. If his part had gone to his children, yes, that would have still been defined as ownership in terms of family inheritance, but not otherwise. This 7.8 section just doesn't make any sense to me. There is a possibility that since this was a buyout, an exit strategy, that perhaps Michael thought the MJ estate with Branca as a head would buy out Sony Music. In Elon's case, it would actually make sense. Tesla is worth, 1 trillion or something, and Twitter is worth 14 billion, maybe more now that Elon has bought it. But in Michael's case, Sony was way bigger than the MJ estate. I never ever think the MJ estate would be able to buy out the other half, simply because Sony was way bigger than the MJ estate. It wouldn't have been possible. So in my opinion, that possibility and scenario is off limits. If I can logically think this through, Michael could never have made a mistake like this. The darker thing here is, after this contract was signed, it would make sense why Invincible was not supported in promotion, or here I admit I might be reaching, but it's possible, why maybe the 2005 allegations happened again. After this contract signature, with this clause, it made his death a much bigger incentive than ever before. Even coming from a layman's perspective, it's pretty logical to know. I'm not saying this is why that all happened, but it's simply logics, that if he dies, this buyout is possible. Any villain of a high caliber, if not actively trying to pull this off, at least would have thought of something like this. And this is planet Earth we're talking about, not some utopian Andromeda planet run by Nordic spiritual masters, Evil is as common as breathing. This contract was signed in 1997. His musical career was steeply declining after Blood on the Dance Floor, and general image and relevance was going down. Let us not compare his sales with other artists' sales when talking about this. He was still way above everyone else. But image-wise and sales-wise, compared to himself, and in terms of direct support from Sony, not so much. We all know that the negative media cycle might have started in 1987, as I said in part 2, which I recommend you watch, when he actually bought the ATV catalog, but MJ's true decline happened in the 21st century, coincidentally or not, after this contract was signed. This contract ultimately was seen as the aftermath of the merging of Sony ATV. The merging of MJ's ATV with Sony happened in 1995, but this contract was created in 1997. Someone created this exit strategy after the merge, maybe as a response to the merge. I don't know, maybe as a two-step plan? ATV merge as step 1 and exit strategy as step 2? Maybe this was the villain's way of getting it back. First merging ATV with Sony and then creating an exit strategy. Or maybe I'm reaching. If section 7.8 is a focal point of all of this, it means that this implementation of this contract and section was not done by Michael, but done by people around him. And this is just theory, of course. I have no proof of it, so don't take these as facts. I can't see the logic behind these though. We know that Mike's team of lawyers around him weren't necessarily out for his best interest. At worst, Michael didn't even know the apparatus around him and who did what. That's how big his organization was, if we can call it that. This is general consensus knowledge. Everyone knows this. But it was thoroughly described as an argument from Debbie Rowe when she was speaking in Mike's 2005 jury case, saying, as described in the book Michael Jackson Conspiracy, that quote, she told the jury that she was worried about the characters around Michael Jackson in early 2003, testifying that she was warned to be careful around certain men. So maybe people around him made this contract. I don't know. The book further says that, quote, Rowe mentioned her old boss, Dr. Arnold Klein, who I think is a person that is cross-associated to both Rowe and Mike. He's not really that important, but he said something that is interesting, whom she had contacted with the hope of having direct contact with Michael to no avail. Rowe told the jury that she contacted Dr. Klein because she wasn't sure Jackson's associates were being honest with her, and indicated that she felt she was being used as a commodity. Obviously, Rowe had her own stuff going on. I don't know too much about this. I don't want to quote everything from the book to make things longer than they need to be, but it's worth mentioning that she says, quote, this Dr. Arnold Klein guy, he just bragged about taking advantage of a situation I'm sure he knew nothing about, and was like everybody else around Michael Jackson. He wasn't telling him everything, end quote. I've read some of the testimonies Rowe comes with in the book, and this dude literally says that he's gonna make a lot of money himself bragging about it to her, but his rationale, of course, is that he's doing it to help him. These guys were obviously not stupid saying everything straight out. Debbie Rowe, who played a substantial role in Mike's life, is someone with first-hand experience being in Michael's life. She could be lying, of course, but it doesn't seem likely, especially since this notion of people around him not being in his best interest is general consensus knowledge. We all know this. In that 2005 court hearings, the judge clearly listened to Debbie Rowe and saw that Mike had few people around him that informed him of everything happening around him. I believe this is a tiny reason for why Michael was free of all charges. The fact that he didn't have people around him with his best interest in heart was taken into account, although it doesn't directly relate to the allegations, it supports him. But does this mean that the apparatus around Michael was so big that contracts such as these actually happened without Mike knowing? Could this contract have been such a contract? His signature is there, as you can see, but the language in the contract is hard to read through, except that 7.8 section. Either Mike didn't look through this contract and it was created without him knowing, or Mike didn't bother to read through it and skim read it, which I doubt, since this is such an important document. Or Mike's lawyers made this happen one way or another, maybe telling Mike about the contract but using different language to Mike than presented in the document, without him knowing what it truly is about. Or what I think happened, the most likely scenario, as I said in the beginning, is that this was simply presented as an exit strategy, but Mike didn't think that far, that his ATV part was entrusted to someone he fully thought he knew. If we go back to what I just said, that Michael might not have read the contract thoroughly, or not even at all, before signing it. I thought about it. First, I thought it was kind of illogical, irrational. Guy such as Mike, with his stature, probably reads everything. Something supported that notion and that argument. And what supports it is something I found in Jermaine Jackson's book, where he says, quote, "It was frustratingly characteristic of Michael to sign a contract without reading the small print, just as in 2000 he had discovered his masters weren't being returned by Sony." And he's talking about the revision I talked about in part 2. Jermaine goes on saying his blind faith in his advisors and the face value honesty of others was his own Achilles heel and had been since Joseph handled our contracts as boys. Joseph is Jackson's father. And the shocker comes when he continues saying the power he'd vested in others dawned on him one day when he overheard an attorney's arrogant remark. "Michael can't sign any of his stuff. He can't approve anything. We approve it." I mean, if Jermaine says this, and this is true, well, there you have it. There you have the signature, the contract, and everything. If this is true, it was simply made without Mike knowing it. And Michael either didn't have the opportunity to read the contract, or he didn't read the contract, or the lawyers kept it away from him and somehow faked the signature. I don't know. All of the arguments I present above could be one of the reasons why we see the signature. But from the villain's perspective, one who disguises himself as an ally but was not, this was the ultimate contract disguise. In other words, Michael probably knew that it was possible for the ATV part to be bought up by Sony because it was a single entity after his death and could thus be bought by anyone if they had the cash, but he never knew that it would be done, especially not from one of his own lawyers, someone he trusted as one of his own. And who were some of the people around him? We have many, but the most noticeable guy around him was Michael Jackson's music attorney, Mr. John Branca. And it's extremely important that we don't paint Mr. Branca as a bad guy here. This is not a social media post trying to vilify Mr. Branca without any proof. I literally have zero proof in this video. This is all just simple theory, a music theory. What up, Matt Pat? For all we know, Branca could have been the sole reason for why MJ became so powerful in the first place. He could have been Michael Jackson's biggest ally in his quest as a powerhouse. There's a reason why MJ was Branca's best man in his wedding. Obviously, he had a liking for him. Personally, he called Branca the greatest lawyer of our time. Branca also gave Mike reasonable advice throughout his career. For instance, when he advised Mike to put up a notice before Thriller that his beliefs were not aligned with their cult. And let's not forget that it was Branca who advised and made it possible for Mike to get the ATV catalog in the first place, and even responsible for merging ATV with Sony. So, from my side, no torches, it's not a malicious post on him, it's just a theory. But also, and this is important, that Mike's relationship with him was at best complicated. Michael fired him at some point, he rehired him again, loving him at one point, not taking a liking to him at other points, so it's complicated. Without evidence, there's nowhere we can go. I practice healthy skepticism, especially when there are some dots to be connected, but I never claim that things are true without any proof. Rationality is important to me. But as Debbie Rose said, there are a lot of shady people around him. Whether or not he was one of them is hard to tell. But there's a side note that thus far is a bit suspicious in terms of Branca. Branca was the one to produce Michael's final will and testament, designating himself as executive. The Jackson family filed a preemptive probate action in the Los Angeles Superior Court based on the allegations that Jackson died intestate without a valid will. Branca still got the role as an executor of the MJ estate legally. Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, after fighting for this and withdrawing the objections, eventually gave up the fight for the best interests of the children. So basically, the family said that Mike had no will. The family said it. Katherine fights for this over the years, but still he inherits the executive role? That's fishy. I found an interesting letter from 2012 regarding this will and the general role of Branca in regards to Mike. This is the letter. The letter had some very interesting paragraphs that I think is worth mentioning. In one of the paragraphs, the siblings, they straight up comment on the will that was created. These are the siblings talking. Since the passing of Michael, our beloved brother, you have failed to perform your duties as an executor of his estate. What you have not failed at is taking advantage of a grieving mother, father, and a grieving family. Your egregious behavior first became obvious only days after his death. John Branca, when we called you regarding the will, you didn't want to interrupt your vacation. You said you wouldn't return for 4 days, at which time you presented to our family an incomplete will. The will that you presented didn't have our brother's signature on it, nor did it have a signature page attached to it. When asked about the missing signature page, John Branca, you replied it was on its way and you were having just a little problem finding it. The shock of Mike's sudden, unexpected passing was overwhelming to our family, to say the least. At that time, we couldn't possibly fathom what is so obvious to us now, that the will, without question, is fake, flawed, and fraudulent. And the letter goes on to saying, quote, amongst many other inconsistencies in the will, there's also a conflict around Michael's location on the day he supposedly signed the will, July 7th, 2002. According to what is witnessed in the document, it's impossible and illogical that he would have been in 2 places at the same time. We have evidence that undoubtedly supports and proves that Michael was absolutely not in Los Angeles, California on the date of his signature reflected in the will at hand, end quote. So no signature and a suspicion that the will is fake based on the proof that Mike was not actually there to sign these documents? Interesting. I wonder if this proof was shown to court hearers and judges, or if there ever was a hearing about Mike's will in court. This notion is coming from family members who of course are biased towards Mike, but still, they more than anyone know when something is up. I don't know, it's a bit suspect to say the least. The letter also talks about Branca manipulating Mike's mother, for instance persuading Katherine Jackson for an executive role for the MJ estate, and shockingly claiming that Branca seemingly had said, quote, I am Michael Jackson now, end quote, after his death. Whew. A lot of other things were said in that letter. I'm leaving a link in the description for the downloads, but as far as the will goes, it's as I led forth. None of the Jackson siblings believe it to be real. So I don't know where I stand on this. My job is to lay out the facts and maybe speculate a little, connecting the dots, and give some thoughts. This is shady, but again, no proof. I want to go back to the This Is It concerts. Keep clause 7.8 in mind. So with ATV as security during the This Is It process for both AEG and Sony, or either one of these, I'm not sure, it makes sense why they pushed him through the concerts despite his health being bad. So I'm kind of split on the AEG forcing him to perform despite his health. Not that they didn't do it, because there's a high likelihood that they did, but whether or not they did it because they knew he would A, either quit, which then would give them a liquefied ATV catalog, if what Jermaine says is true, that the ATV catalog was held as a security, or B, the much more sinister possibility that he would die, which would then trigger the exit strategy in section 7.8 from the contract in 1997 and make it possible for Sony to buy up ATV. It's hard to say, but what is not hard to say, and this is a fact, they extended Mike's concert streak from him doing 10 concerts to 50 concert in the leaked emails that AEG sent, and these are some of the replies they sent amongst each other. We can see what the inner dialogue was when these concerts were going on. Listen to this and tell me if they knew that he wouldn't be able to finish the 50 concert streak. Quote, MJ is locked in his room drunk and despondent. That was one of the messages read from Randy Phillips to AEG president, who replied, are you kidding me? He's an emotionally paralyzed mess, riddled with self-loathing and doubt now that it's showtime, end quote. Kenny Ortega, who I believe was an ally of MJ, also said in one of the emails that he was a, quote, lost boy and needed a psychiatric evaluation as soon as possible. Which Michael didn't get, of course, because he presumably, according to AEG, was just fine. So, to the insurance companies, they said that he's fine. Please give us that $7.5 million insurance policy. But at the same time, they had these messages going back and forth with 50 concerts. So, I don't know if AEG was separate from Sony. As I said in part 2, I could only find one connection between the two. The Columbia Pictures, owned by Sony, striking a deal with AEG to create the This Is It movies. So obviously they had something to do with each other, but whether or not AEG knew about Section 7.8 1997 contract is something I cannot answer. At the same time, as I said in the beginning, Mike's only chance of keeping the ATV catalog at this point, since he was in debt, was to go through with performing this streak of concerts, as Jermaine said he was. So, in my opinion, if we are going the most sinister route, they most likely extended the 10-day concert tour to 50 on purpose, using the public health statement, he's fine, as a reason to extend them, resulting in them getting a liquefied ATV because he health-wise wouldn't be able to finish the concert, or even more maliciously, he would die. But also, this is the tin foil hat part of me. It could also be simply that ATV wanted to maximize profits, and since they wanted to maximize profits, they saw that they could extend the 10-day concert tour to 50 concerts to get as much profit as possible. I mean, businesses happen in that way. Michael had many enemies because of this catalog. And when even the mainstream media uses the emails I exemplified as a proof of AEG knowing that his health was not good, you know something is up. In all, I'm gonna say something now, and this is just me thinking. What if the Sony ATV merge, not the acquisition, but the merge, was the biggest mistake of Mike's life? Obviously, the ATV acquisition was a good deal. It kept Sony still separate from ATV. But what if the merge with Sony was his downfall, that made it possible for shady people around him to get him to where he ended? What if a Sony ATV merge like this was the only way for Sony to get the catalog back? Think about it. With ATV separate from Sony, Sony would have no say over the contracts with Mike. I don't know if Branca made these contracts or if Sony had the biggest say, but chances are Sony were very contributive in creating these contracts. It was Sony who suggested and agreed to a partnership in the first place to have any dabbling power over ATV at all. Jermaine does say this in his book. 9 years later, John Branca would take this coup to the next level. Michael's own label, Sony, had said it wanted to buy half of the ATV catalog, but it was not for sale. Sony wanted to do business. Michael wouldn't budge. The record label presumably had to think again. The deal that was eventually struck appeared to give Michael an even firmer grip on the music industry because Sony agreed to a partnership. As the most sinister theory, and it's just a theory, did Sony actually offer Mike something that he couldn't resist just to potentially buy his part up? As I said, in a parallel universe where Sony hadn't merged with ATV, there would be no triggering sections such as 7.8 because they would not have been affiliated with each other and would have nothing to do at all with Mike. They would have been two separate entities. I might be totally off mark here, but these are some of the thoughts that came up to me. If there is a supervillain here, a three-step plan of 1. First, merging the companies, starting internally in Mike's mind, disguising it as the best move ever. 2. Somehow creating contracts that split the companies after the artist's death. And 3. Creating and using a clause that triggers, the removal of the one single factor, aka Michael Jackson, who initially, as Jermaine said, wouldn't budge when Sony asked for a purchase of ATV. To finally conquer ATV would be a legal way to go forth. All of these steps would be legal. Removing the one hindrance, Michael himself, via a death section in a contract that he seemingly signed would also be what I would do if I was a villain. It makes sense why a potential supervillain, and again, I'm not saying anyone here is a villain, but if there was, would plant indirect moves that would devastate his image publicly, but also his mental health to 1. Either get him in debt, or 2. Somehow lead to his death by, perhaps stop promoting the man's career or other more malevolent things, and you know what I'm hinting at here. There was every incentive for this man to go away, either by being imprisoned, as the allegations worst case scenario would make possible, where he would lose the ATV part. Remember, as I said in part 2, Tom Mesereau said that it was highly probable that a thing like this would be an agenda from both Sony and the child molestation accusers, attorneys. Subconsciously, Sony would get the catalog and Tom Sneddon and other attorneys would get fame and riches. I'm just saying, dude had the darkest people against him, and still, he was not able to be sentenced because he was innocent. He died though. But of course, this whole thing can be as simple as Mike purchased ATV, chose to merge it with Sony, Mike died, and his lawyers wanted to sell it to Sony. As straightforward as this, without any theory or anything. That could also be possible. So, in part 1, when I started this series, a 50% stake in Sony ATV seemed like a triumph, but I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole potentially went. if what my research says is true. The sad truth about the acquisition is not that Mike became powerful. Yes, literally he did become powerful, and that's a great thing, but rather that it possibly could have been the biggest mistake of his life. And his life, if all of this is true, was the price. What we now know as the legendary Michael owns 50% of Sony ATV should, in my opinion, if all of these suspicions are true, be known as, quote, the acquisition that could have been his biggest downfall. Was this the ultimate move the lawyers around Michael made? Not to give him the benefit, but to actually create a contract from inside that incentivized his death, hence finally being able for Sony to get the ATV part back. If this was the case, there is some dark stuff going on behind the scenes, and I hate to admit it. A master plan created by some villains that indeed were able to tempt and get hold of the greatest entertainer of all time, Mr. Michael Jackson. But his influence is far greater than a catalog, and his legacy will continue to be spoken about for hundreds of years in the future. In retrospect, I know Mike will be the artist that future generation will talk about as the greatest entertainer of all time, while Sony's ATV inheritors will most likely not be remembered. I also wouldn't be surprised if some truths about Michael Jackson slowly start showing up in our lifetimes. Truths that will make us critically inclined to never build a media machine as negative as the one he experienced. So, that's it guys. Hope you subscribe, like, and comment if you liked it. I don't think there will be a part 4 to this because I don't think the rabbit hole goes deeper. For now, this is where it's ending. Peace.